more energy. All right. So in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about engineering ethics and professionalism. And we're going to look at a couple of different things. Some of this will be completed on your own since you're doing this online. But we're going to start by talking about the professional engineer. From the state of Indiana, it says that a professional engineer is an individual who, by reason of that individual's special knowledge of the mathematical and physical sciences and the principles and methods of engineering analysis and design, which are acquired by education and practical experience, is qualified to engage in the practice of engineering as attested by that individual's registration as a professional engineer. That's a lot of fancy words to basically say this is a professionally licensed engineer. And we'll talk about here how and why I've become a professional engineer. How do we do it? The first thing we do is we take and pass the FE, Fundamentals of Engineering exam, upon graduation from an ABET accredited program. Our mechanical, electrical, and computer engineering programs are currently accredited, and we anticipate going up for mechatronics accreditation here quickly. And then you need to work for or with a professional engineer, someone who is already licensed for a certain amount of time. Usually that's 4 to 5 years as an EIT, that means an engineer in training, or an engineer intern. You'll see those depending on which state you're in, and then have them recommend you. The next thing you need to do is take and pass the PE exam. The PE exam is the professional engineer's exam. So let's start with the FE. The FE goes over your undergraduate information. So if you're an electrical engineer, you'll take a test which is specifically aimed towards electrical and computer stuff. Computers take the same test, and then there's a separate test for mechanical engineering. The PE exam is a little more specialized. So just be aware that is a thing, and let's talk about why you might want to do that. The first reason is prestige. This is an elite professional licensure like an MD or a JD. Another good reason is that if you're working in the power industry or in civil engineering and some mechanical industries, you need to have a PE because it allows you to sign off on plans and put your stamp on it, which essentially says that you certify that you've reviewed this and it meets the design standards. You also use it for consulting work, so you're able to do consulting a little bit easier if you have a professional engineer's licensure. Another good reason is that you can speak publicly on your subject matter as a subject matter expert when needed. And then the last and probably biggest reason for college students who see this is probably because there's a pay increase. So for example, I have a former student who started working for a company that does power for buildings, and so a professional engineer's licensure is very important there. And just by passing the FE, they got a $5,000 pay raise, and then that will go up even more after they take the PE exam and become a professional engineer. So those are some really good reasons why. Now, associated with this, the professional engineer actually has what's called the Engineer's Creed. And it says this: as a professional engineer, I dedicate my professional knowledge and skill to the betterment of human welfare. I pledge to give my utmost of performance, to participate in none but honest enterprise, to live and work according to the laws of man and the highest standards of professional conduct, to place service before profit, the honor and standing of the profession before personal advantage, and the public welfare above all other considerations. In humility and with need for divine guidance, I make this pledge. So let's unpack that a little bit. Basically, that says, as a professional engineer, I'm going to do my best, I'm going to be honest, I'm going to hold high standards of professional conduct, and I'm going to place service before profit, and the honor and standing of the profession before personal gain or other considerations. So what that really is speaking to is that I'm going to act ethically as an engineer, and we're going to talk about ethics as part of this lecture. Just for comparison, there is Another thing which is called the obligation of the engineer, and that's actually this ring that I wear on my pinky finger. It's part of the order of the engineer. You can read this, but it basically says all the same stuff. Again, getting to the point that as an engineer, since our goal as an engineer is to design things which help others, to solve problems by making designs to help the public or help others, we need to have some sort of guidelines on how we should behave. So that takes us to engineering ethics. So ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behavior or conduct. And this allows us to systematize, defend, and recommend concepts of right and wrong behavior. Ethical codes are adopted by organizations or professions to help members determine the difference between right and wrong conduct and apply that knowledge to their decisions. So at this point, if we were in class, we would do the first in-class activity, ethical situations. I'm going to just show it to you, but I'm going to point out that this is on Canvas underneath this slideshow. So let's skip down here. All right, so in-class activity 1, basically it says, for each of the following situations, indicate whether you think the action is ethical or unethical, or if you're unsure, don't read ahead and don't go back and change your answers. And then in class, we would talk about some of these things a little bit. So I would encourage you to do that because I think it's a helpful exercise. So how do we know the difference between right and wrong? Well, over time, a lot of different philosophers have looked at ethics, at codes of ethics, of ways that we should behave, with the overall goal of making society a better place. And so we'll actually talk about a couple different ones historically, so that way we can work our way towards engineering ethics. So Aristotle had this idea of the golden mean, which basically says that if I want to have good conduct, I need to have a virtuous character. We actually don't care what virtue is, but we want to become good. Otherwise, there's no profit in it. So we're trying to figure out how to be virtuous of character in order to be good. And he considers a virtue to be a mean between two extremes. So let's give me, for example, prudence is a key virtue, which is practical wisdom. Temperance is self-control. It's the mean between excessive pleasure and being insensitive to pleasure. So he would say that if you only are seeking after pleasure, or if you don't want any pleasure at all, those are both bad, but being in the middle is good. Courage is another key virtue in the case where you have fear or cowardice and overconfidence, and justice is concerned with what is doing right. Those are key virtues to Aristotle. Another philosopher, Kant, who was a German guy, a lot later than Aristotle, basically says that goodwill is the only virtue that is unqualifiedly good, and the goodwill is always good and maintains its moral value when it fails to achieve its moral intentions. And then he basically points out that we have different types of duties based on goodwill. Basically, he says that the categorical imperative are duties that are morally binding based on reason. Basically, I'll explain this on the next slide, but basically what he's saying is if we can reason out how not acting like this would make the world, then it's something we must do to make the world better. And so basically what he says is we have a perfect duty not to act by maxims that result in logical contradictions when we attempt to universalize them. For example, he would say an example maxim that we can test is it is permissible to lie. And then he reasons out what happens if everyone behaves this way. And so he would say we have a perfect duty to not lie, because if everybody lied, we'd be in trouble. On the other hand, he also defines what are called imperfect duties, which is something that is typically beneficial but can't be universalized or would be impossible to continually follow. For example, it's beneficial to be generous, but not to the point where you can't afford food or shelter for yourself. And when there's a conflict between these two duties, it asks you, his moral framework would say, follow the perfect duty. So moving, I guess, backward in time between Kant and Aristotle, we essentially have Christian ethics, which suggests that you should love God and love your neighbor. And so Christian ethics basically say that the most important commandment is to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so if we look at the Ten Commandments, which were, from Exodus in the Bible, there's essentially two types of ethics described there. There's metaphysical ethics, which are about a deity, in this case, Yahweh or God. And then the entire rest of the Ten Commandments are behavioral ethics, which is about how we treat each other. So honor your father and mother, don't commit murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony or lie, don't covet what your neighbor has. And so these are sort of rules of behavior which come along with this Christian ethical framework. So with some historical context there on what ethics historically have looked like, let's look at some engineering ethical codes. So in particular, I'm going to look at what the National Society of Professional Engineers say, as well as IEEE, which is the Electrical and Electronics and Computer Engineering Professional Society, and ASME, which is the American Society for Mechanical Engineers. So the National Society of Professional Engineers says, here is the ethical framework. There's more specifics at that link, which you can visit. But basically it says, we're going to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. We're going to perform services only in our area of competence. So that means I'm an electrical engineer. I can't publicly state what's wrong with a design of a bridge. That's not in my area of competence. We will only issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, meaning we're not trying to persuade people, just giving facts and truthfully. That we're supposed to act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, that we should avoid deceptive acts, and that we should conduct ourselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. All of this is sort of contained in that original engineer's creed that I showed you at the beginning of the lecture. But basically what we're saying is that ethically, we're going to follow these, and then they give more detail here. And so some of these are really important, specifically trying not to be deceptive, be a faithful agent or trustee. That means don't take bribes, and essentially do everything as sort of going back to the Christian ethics idea of doing to others as you would want to have done to you, of loving your neighbor as yourself, and so on. So IEEE ethics are more succinct in their big statements, but much more detailed in their more detailed statements. So that's what's here in this details. But mostly it says the same things. ASME, again, says about the same things, and you can hit the actual link there to look at those details. So now we have some frameworks for ethical decision making for engineering. I'd like to do the next in-class activity, and of course in class we would do this, but let me show it to you. So for each of the following situations, indicate how great you feel the need is in the world to solve the problems listed. Don't read ahead, don't go back and change your answers. And then obviously in the real lecture, I would give some time to discuss these things, but it's at least a useful exercise for you to look at. So back to my slides. There are some grand challenges in engineering, which were established by the National Academy of Engineering, NAE. And they have 14 challenges for the 21st century. Some of them include things like advance personalized learning, make solar energy economical, engineer better medicines, secure cyberspace, develop carbon sequestration methods, engineer the tools of scientific discovery. And there's a link here for that. And the reason that I want to bring this up is that most of these are rooted in some idea of ethics or justice or sustainability, which are all important things for engineers. So ABET asks us to introduce these things, because if we don't do them, then I think we're ethically falling short of what we should be doing as we educate engineering students. And so I just want to highlight, like, provide access to clean water. That's something that engineers can make a dramatic impact on for areas or countries or people groups who lack that access to clean water. So some of this is what has inspired us to do humanitarian engineering, which is our complementary major, which will give you some tools for going out and serving others with your skills. And if you're interested in that, please talk to me. But it involves actually taking a service trip at some point. So just wanted to make you aware of those grand challenges. So one more thing to talk about here is we've sort of talked about ethics. Let's talk a little bit about professionalism. So we can talk about professional societies. So I mentioned earlier IEEE and ASME. But what else do professional societies do? So one thing they do is they offer professional development opportunities, things like workshops, sponsored talks, conferences. They provide networking opportunities, local and national meetings. So a society I don't have here, SWE, is the Society of Women Engineers. They just had their national meeting in Indianapolis a couple weeks ago, and it was an opportunity for a lot of female engineers to gather and be inspired, have opportunities, network with companies, and we have some students who are essentially walking away from that experience with a handful of internship opportunities. Professional societies also publish research, so they have conferences and they have journals. Another example of a professional society for me is the American Society for Engineering Education. And so, like, I submit papers, scholarly research papers, to that conference about how we do engineering education and use references from there as resources. Another thing that professional societies do is they maintain standards. So IEEE 802.11 is Wi-Fi. That's an example of a standard which is maintained by a professional society. So at this point, the rest of the time, what we're going to do is look at and discuss a little bit some different case studies. I am not going to click on these links. I'm going to ask you to watch at least a couple of them and think about them. I would mainly recommend the Space Shuttle Challenger and Ford Pinto case studies if you have time, just to think about. And then the homework assignments associated with this will ask you to look at some case studies or watch a video and comment on what you're seeing there. So that's it for these ethics lectures. Obviously, if we were in class, they would take a little bit longer because we'd watch these videos and we'd do the in-class assignments. But otherwise, please let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you when we see you.